Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another show of the Daanish TV English language channel, the global voice of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality here in Islamabad, Pakistan. And we are continuing our incredibly important series on this question of normalization with the State of Israel, which for many of us involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement should not even be a question to be debated. But of course, many of our governments do not understand that, and therefore we have to kind of clarify the issues involved here, the morality, also the geopolitics of what's going on, and so on. And so for us here at Daanish TV, for many Pakistanis, those involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, although we have heard, and this is also giving our guests a little context, I will introduce them in a second, but although we have heard our Prime Minister, Imran Khan, now say 14 times that we are not going to normalize relations with Israel until the following conditions are met, which of course Israel has no plan on meeting right now, we are still very much concerned. The pressures and the threats coming from so-called Muslim brotherly countries in the Gulf and the United States continue. And those are severe threats like deportation of laborers, stopping the gas and oil to Pakistan, etc. All sorts of threats have been involved, and of course some supposed carrots are being offered, which of course may be a mirage and imaginary. So this is the context both for our guests and of course our global viewership, our Pakistani viewership, that we still remain very much concerned, despite these statements from our Prime Minister on this question, that the pressures are just so immense that we want to continue to sustain our narrative about how this is utterly unacceptable. And we take a very clear position on this. And we could do no better tonight, at least tonight for us, not for Brother Ramzy in Seattle, but to have two of the most relentless, uncompromising, well-known Palestinian speakers for justice for the Palestinians. And that is exactly what I wanted on this show today. And I'll briefly introduce them. Dr. Ramzy Baroud, he's editor of Palestine Chronicle. And just beyond that, I mean, on a personal note, I met him at in Istanbul, and I'll get to that at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs conference. And his writings and the way he spoke. Actually, I met him in Norfolk, Virginia, the first time. And our Students for Justice for Palestine there, in this very militarized area, we were working for years. And Brother Ramzy's appearance there, I don't know if you'll remember, appearance there in one talk, he was able to move the hearts and minds of so many of the people there for the cause of the justice for the Palestinians. So Brother Ramzy's art writings, his talks so poignantly point to the injustice and the cruelties that the Palestinians have been suffering. So we're so glad to have him on. Dr. Ramzy, welcome. And then we have Dr. Sami Al-Arian. He's the director for the Center of Islam and Global Affairs. And I want to also say that both Brother Ramzy and myself are, of course, associated as research fellows with the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. And I also want to say two things. One, about the think tank itself, CIGA, Center for Islam and Global Affairs. It perhaps, in my opinion, arguably is the most cutting-edge think tank in the Islamicate world today. It gets the finest scholars, finest scholarship and thinking on questions of the intellectual thinking, geopolitical thinking, so on the most pressing issues of today. So I think everyone should look out for what CIGA is constantly organizing. It's just amazing. And as for Dr. Sami Al-Arian, He is a dear friend, a mentor, just an inspirational figure for so many of us in terms of also his defense, not just of the Palestinian cause of civil freedoms, through his own personal struggles, and what he has continued to do. So, in fact, both of Dr. Ramzy Baroud and Dr. Sami Al-Arian, two inspirational figures, two mentors, and two dear friends that we have with us today. So it's a real delight and an honor for me to have both of you. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So obviously the topic, the broad topic, is the case against normalization for Israel. And what I like to begin with is just a very simple question: is to make the case why Pakistan or any other country, for that matter, should not normalize. And I don't want to make this sound too simple, but in some ways, I think this is what we can begin with. What is at stake here for all the countries that are being enticed and pressured to normalize with Israel? What is the case against that normalization with the state of Israel? Perhaps Ramzy, we can begin with you.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for having us, and it's such a pleasure to be speaking to you, Brother Junaid, and to your audience, but also to our sisters and brothers in Pakistan. The affinity that we have with our brothers there, this precedes the conversation on normalization by many, many years. Pakistan is a very dear friend of Palestine, and the Palestinian people are genuinely perhaps the most supportive of all Muslims anywhere. And this is something that I have experienced everywhere I've been. There's this overwhelming, unconditional love and support for Palestine and the Palestinians coming from our brothers in Pakistan. The main argument, of course, here, and this is something that every Muslim should relate to, and that is the moral argument. And the moral argument here is that if you normalize with any sort of evil, then you are accepting and embracing, unconditionally embracing this evil. Those amongst you who sees an evil should try to change it with his hand, and if he can't, then by with his tongue, and if he can't, then by his heart, and that's the weakest of faiths. This is a maxim that we have all been, a simple, basic Muslim maxim that we have all been raised to believe in, and yet this evil perpetuates. The siege, the apartheid, the military occupation, colonialism, imperialism, daily violence meted out against the Palestinian people, simple cases of starvation, outright starvation in the 21st century. Palestinians are being used as a social experiment by Israel to murder and to brutalize as they see fit. This is the greatest form of evil perhaps that exists in the world today. And yet here we are even having a conversation. Why should this evil be normalized, despite the fact that that evil hasn't changed, hasn't relented in any possible way? So that is the first argument, the moral argument. The second argument is the political argument. If we put morality aside for a minute, and we should never do that, but if we are to do so, let's just think about it from a rational point of view. Egypt has normalized with Israel over 40 years ago. Jordan has normalized with Israel 26 years ago. How did they benefit? Yes, they were under immense pressure. Yes, they were under political siege and by the US and the West and their colonial supporters in the Western Hemisphere. But how did they benefit? Is Egypt better off? Is Jordan better off? They remain either economically very, very weak. Egypt in particular is rife in political corruption. The money that they have been received is in exchange for selling out their Palestinian brethren have been used largely for military purposes, not to defend Egypt, but to benefit a specific class. Now, this is for Pakistan is a whole different story. This is a country that is trying to bring back civil society, a country that is trying to win for the sake of democracy, not a country that wants to further contribute to the kind of corruption that exists in many Muslim countries. So just look at the cases of Egypt. and Jordan, and you will realize that there's absolutely no benefit coming in today, in 26 years or in 40 years. So please withstand this pressure. It's just a phase. And eventually you will have the moral upper hand, and you will be in a position that would allow you to actually play a role, not just of solidarity with Palestine only, but a role of leadership in the entire Muslim world. This is what Pakistan is destined for, and this is what Pakistan should aspire to achieve.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramzy Baroud. Dr. Sabi Al-Arian?
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me and being part of this important discussion. And thank you for your generous introduction as well. I think one could also make, yes, we can make probably arguments on three levels: the moral level, the civilizational level, I would say, and the geopolitical one. On the moral level, Ramzy talked about the morality of the conflict. But I think if there is anything that Israel wants or striving for or covets, it's legitimacy, because they lack legitimacy. Israel was founded on the myth that this was a land without a people, and now everybody knows that Palestine has existed for thousands of years, and that the Palestinian people have existed for thousands of years, and the Zionist movement lied and got itself into the situation to colonize Palestine on these myths. And now we are at the point where, after over 7 decades of that occupation and over a century of this conflict, they still don't have legitimacy. And regardless of how many people or how many nations, I'd say, recognize Israel as a state, it still lacks legitimacy, because it was founded on these myths, on these lies. And the normalization process, what it does is it confers legitimacy. What they lacked so far, for all these decades, was not only that the Palestinians never gave up their rights, but also the Muslim world, for the most part, shunned that legitimacy. Very few countries in the Muslim world had recognized Israel, but now it seems like the door has opened for many nations, Muslim nations, because of certain narrow interests or calculations. They want to recognize Israel at the expense of Palestinian rights and Muslim and Christian rights, and of course under tremendous pressure. And a nation like Pakistan, with almost 200 million people, obviously is a big prize for Israel, and it covets that, it wants that, it needs that. But the other case about why we shouldn't normalize is a civilizational one. The Muslim Ummah has existed from the advent of the 7th century, from the time of the Prophet, until about a century ago. For about 1300 years, it had its what we call the first universality of Islam. It was a powerful nation. It was one of the major powers in the world for many centuries. It led the world in many spheres, including at the civilization level, including obviously philosophy, law, commerce, economy, trade, science, literature, you name it. It was the Muslim medicine. It was the Muslim world was leading the world. And then we had different conflicts, and then the gap widened between the West and the Muslim world, and the West was able to colonize much of the Muslim world for many years. Starting obviously with their 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and then that ended up with fragmenting the Muslim world into the nation-state system, where the Muslim world now is quite weak. But to cement that weakness was the creation of Israel, because Israel is also a functional state for colonization, for imperialism. And those who are supporters of Israel, they want to keep Israel as a buffer state in the heart of the Muslim world, to keep the Muslim world fragmented, divided, weak permanently. And that's the geopolitical aspect of this, which is very important. And to normalize, to confer that legitimacy on Israel, basically tries to maintain that status quo where the Muslim world will never rise up, will never have its own renaissance, so to speak, where they can start their second universality, meaning that they can rise again as a great nation. And Israel is basically is the cornerstone of this situation, and we cannot accept this. I mean, even at moments of weakness, you cannot accept first of all the myth or the narrative of those who are trying to legitimize the existence and presence of the state of Israel. And let me differentiate here between Zionism and Judaism. This is nothing about Judaism. The conflict in Palestine is not a religious conflict. It's a geopolitical conflict, per excellence. This is a conflict that wants to maintain the Arab world and the Muslim world, and certainly at the expense of the Palestinians, to the point they can stay, as I said, weak, fragmented, and divided. And the using Judaism to further that is one of the greatest crimes that have been committed. And what we're saying here is that we cannot legitimize this, because what it does is that it says that the use of Judaism by Zionism is legitimized, and that should not be also legitimized. And I think when we say that the solution to Palestine is to do away with this racist ideology that is trying to gain recognition and gain normality and legitimacy, should never be allowed.
Thank you, Dr. Sab. One of the points that Dr. Ramzy had out. Sorry, there's an echo. Was about what benefit, putting aside the morality of the issue, what benefit to Pakistan would such a normalization entail? And it's a very compelling argument in those societies where at least there was some level of civil society, like Jordan or Egypt, etc. What have they gained from their normalization from Israel, other than the entrenchment of forms of dictatorship and autocracy and impoverishment for the masses of the people? So I think that is one thing that the Pakistanis should learn from, that even in societies that are more like it, other than unlike the Gulf states now that are normalizing, that we have evidence in front of us that the promise of some type of carrot never came through. But the next question I did want to ask is that many people are asking all of a sudden in Pakistan that all of a sudden the timing of this process of normalization. Now we do know that, of course, that ties between some of these countries, whether it's the United Arab Emirates and so on, and between Israel, were going on in terms of intelligence cooperation and so on, even economic ties. But what is the impulse now driving the motivation for normalizing and compelling other countries to follow suit as well, Arab and non-Arab? Dr. Ramzy?
It's a brilliant question, really. I think this is the main question right now. Why the rush for normalization? This has been going on for such a long time. The peace process began, the so-called peace process began in the early 1990s. A status quo really was established based on this new, American-led political discourse, and they were happy with it. The Israelis are colonizing Palestine slowly, and the Americans are playing the role of the leader of the Middle East, the political leader of the Middle East, using the peace process as a way to divide the Arabs and Muslims into the good guys and the bad guys, radicals versus extremists, and so forth. And it's working out just good and dandy. Why change it now? And here's the reason of why this is changing. Because the geopolitics of the Middle East is changing, or the geopolitics is changing, in the sense that since the Iraq war has really kind of taught the Americans the limits, their military limits of how far they can actually utilize their military to achieve political ends, that has come to an end thanks to the resistance in Iraq. Then you have the upheaval in the Arab world, what is called the Arab Spring, which really kind of galvanized civil societies and ordinary people to play a role in shaping the political outlook. I know it's still an undecided outcome, but it is a process. The Americans are finding it so very difficult to impose themselves as the only deciders, as George W. Bush once described the US as the decider. They are no longer the only decider. Other countries are there. China is growing in clout, in economic clout, but in geopolitical clout as well. Russia is growing in terms of its military influence. Iran is growing regionally as well. Turkey has achieved a great deal of success to impose itself as an economic power, as a military power throughout the Middle East, from Libya to Qatar and so forth and so on, which means that the US could no longer sustain the status quo. The US is moving from the Middle East slowly. In Libya, they launched a war, calling it leadership from behind, meaning that they are no longer going to take charge of wars and therefore the negative consequences of war, and so forth and so on. This is something that they could not sustain, which means the US is so keen at reordering the geopolitics of the Middle East in Israel's favor. Let's create a new camp. It's not about moderates versus extremists. This is about the pro-Israel camp in the Middle East to fight Iran, Turkey, and other influences in the region. Now, is this a camp that Pakistan really, I mean, if just a simple look in the mirror, yes, we understand the geopolitical needs and we understand the nature of alliances, and sometimes politics can be ugly, but is this a camp that Pakistan wants to be in? Please just imagine this scenario. Sadly, it will happen. Israel attacks Gaza again, kills hundreds of children, thousands of civilians, bodies littering the streets, mosques being destroyed, people being humiliated and brutalized again and again, and it's beamed all over the world. And you have an Israeli ambassador in Islamabad whining and dining with Pakistani officials. How can you actually, even from a political and strategic point of view, can Pakistan and the Pakistani government deal and imagine this scenario? Yes, the situation is changing in the Middle East, but this gives Pakistan actually an opportunity, because Pakistan is not a small country and it's not a weak country, and it cannot allow itself to be used as a pawn, as a lackey in some American chess game that may or may not succeed. And in my political opinion, it will not succeed because the rules of the game have changed entirely. It behooves Pakistan to just take its time and to reimagine its role in the Middle East, not as an American lackey, but as an Islamic leader in a region that is in constant influx, and it will be in constant influx for the coming years as well.
Absolutely. Dr. Ramzy, some wonderful points. Before I turn it over to Dr. Sami, and I can points from both of you compelled me to kind of also argue that basically you're absolutely correct when we say that Pakistan, the geopolitical situation within the broader Middle East or West Asia, including Pakistan, has changed significantly. And including to Turkey and Iran and so forth. And it is particularly right now that Pakistan finds itself at this crossroads in which there's the pressure from, on the one side, the Gulf, and then what we saw, both of you may remember what happened in the Kuala Lumpur summit, where they're forbidden to go to there. So it does find itself at a crossroads. And I think, Dr. Ramzy, and as Dr. Sami was saying, that Pakistan is this great prize, country of 220 million, nuclear armed, formidable country that if they can get in this process. But of course, Pakistan is no longer the same Pakistan, caught in the old Cold War framework. So there are significant decisions to be made by the policymakers in this country right now. And I think you guys are hitting the nail on the head, that the geopolitics have shifted so much that it does provide an opportunity for Pakistan to do that. So I just wanted to note that's a very important point. But Dr. Sami, please, if you wanted to add to the discussion.
Sure. First of all, if we look at Egypt, when Egypt signed a treaty with Israel back in 1979, the Egyptian pound was $1.40. Today, the dollar is 15.7 pounds. That's a loss of 96% of its value. So today's pound is worth about 4% of what it was worth when they signed. So certainly the economic argument falls on its face. You can just look at Egypt's economy. It's a complete basket case today. And when you look at all the things that the Egyptians were promised at the time, you know, with the honey and milk that's going in, that's coming in into the country because of peace and all that, that's obviously nowhere to be seen. It turned Egypt to become more like a client state of the United States. And I don't want to go over, you know, what the evidence is. It's quite clear. But also when you look at the loss of Egypt's stature within the Arab world, within the Islamic world, even within the world, because of this situation, because basically what they signed was to get back the Sinai minus the sovereignty that any respected country would get. Yes, they have possession over the Sinai, but they lost the total control or sovereignty of Sinai, and we see also the manifestation of this. But look at the picture broadly when we talk about normalization, and particularly why now? That's the question you asked, why now?
Right.
And certainly there is a sense, there is a feeling within some political actors in the region, and particularly they were encouraged with the Trump administration that this was an opportune time to impose a new map in the Middle East, so to speak, where Israel would be leading the pack by re-establishing certain alliances in the region where they can pick and choose their enemies and try to keep them down. And particularly those enemies that they have chosen are the ones who are championing democracy, freedom, you know, dignity, human rights, rule of law, as well as standing up against colonial powers and imperialist dictates, particularly Israel. So all those who are trying to maintain their control, you know, the authoritarian regimes, the dictatorships, the ones who thought that the Arab Spring phenomena is a big threat to their rule and to their presence and existence, are now in the same camp with Israel. And Israel has been leading this, and the aim and objective of Israel is pretty clear. And this has been established, you know, for decades. Israel thinks that it cannot rule and control and have hegemony over the entire region unless they not only keep the status quo, but even further fragment the Arab world. So they find their hands into in the division of Sudan. You find their hands in trying to establish a Kurdish state. You find their hands in many of the conflicts that exist today, whether sectarian, ethnic, or otherwise. And they want to keep it that way, and they try to establish these alliances. So anyone who's going to stand up against Israel and against its brutal occupation of the Palestinians is going to be basically the target of these groups. And normalization is the best way to ease up that leadership for Israel that it had for a long time, but secretly, and now they want it to be in the open. And of course, Netanyahu has been working on this, and he's been saying this for years. I mean, he's been saying, at least for the past decades, how close he is with many of the regimes in the Arab world, in the Middle East, and how this it's been fruitful for Israel to maintain its hegemony. And I think that's quite clear. And I don't think people who respect their people, I mean, leaders who respect their people, want to be part of that camp. It would be a really shameful if, you know, someone who is coming through a democratic process and representing the great people of Pakistan would like to be part of this a minority who are trying to suppress democracy and suppress human rights and suppress being independent and being basically as lackeys for Israel. And I think that's a great point to understand.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you raised that, Dr. Sami, because, of course, I think both of you would know that Prime Minister Imran Khan, and of course before as well, the Pakistani government, of course, has had a strong position on the question of Kashmir. And of course, the situation in Kashmir has gotten profoundly worse, not only in terms of the brutal military occupation, but also now taking straight from the playbook of the Israeli model, the settler colonial model, bringing in Indian settlers from other parts of India into Kashmir to try to change the demographics of Kashmir, and that close relationship between Israel and India right now that you may have been following as well. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but my own argument that we have put to at least Prime Minister Imran Khan is that would be the ultimate form of hypocrisy to be such a vocal proponent against the injustices and cruelties of the military occupation and the settler colonialism of what India is doing in Kashmir, while normalizing and selling out the Palestinians. I mean, I don't know.
Let me say, as honestly as I could, the solution to the Muslim world right now is to gain its independence. Is not to be dependent on the others or to be colonized, whether directly or indirectly. And the existence of Israel is basically this. If you allow Israel to exist, then basically you're allowing, Israel and those behind it to keep their control over us, our destiny, our future. And we have to reject this. And those who are trying to normalize are going in the wrong direction. What we need to do is to work on to dismantle the state of Israel, meaning that this Zionist, racist, apartheid regime that is trying to disrupt and destabilize and colonize not only Palestine, but they are hoping for the entire region, not necessarily directly, but indirectly, this project must be dismantled. And again, that is not anything against the Jews. The Jews or those who attribute themselves to the religion of Judaism are also victims of Zionism. We are saying that the Zionist project in Palestine is a project that targets everyone in the region, whether directly or indirectly, and that should be rejected. That could, people could find this to be a statement that is not in line with others, but that's the fact that we need to face. And Pakistan has absolutely no need to normalize right now. They are not even borders. And you mentioned the issue of Kashmir, and it's the height of hypocrisy when we try to call on the Muslim world to support the struggle in Kashmir against this Hindutva, against this nationalist government that is trying to impose and use the same tactics and impose the same system that Israel has been imposing on the Palestinians, and then normalize with Israel. I understand the pressures Pakistan is under, but that's what leadership is about. Leadership is to stand up for what's right and to also take strong positions regardless of pressures and to find other solutions. We need a solution that will go beyond just simply the interest of this state or that. We need a solution that can actually address the problems that the Muslim world is facing today. And I think we can actually have a different kind of alliance. We have countries, great countries, who have leadership who rejects this hegemony and control, who want to be independent, whether starting from Turkey or Pakistan or Malaysia or Iran or what have you, and they can have their own alliance to stand up to this pressure. The Israel actually is crumbling. That project, despite of how they want to present it as being a success story, it's actually a failing story. And I have mentioned in many other forums that the imperatives that keep Israel strong actually are falling apart. We just have to do our role. And I can tell you that Israel will not survive as it is if it wasn't for this massive support it's getting from some regional dictators as well as great powers who only see geopolitical gains and don't see anything that has to do with the rights of the people.
That's absolutely right. Dr. Sami, I mean, this is one of the key points in this entire discussion is precisely how what Imran Khan is compelled to say, the brotherly Muslim countries, to which I've said to him, with brothers like these, and you can fill in the blank, but the pressures that they have put on Pakistan, and it is, again, going back to your point, these an alternative bloc of nations, very formidable nations within the Islamicate world, it is precisely that fear emerging from the Gulf, some of these countries that are in favor of normalization, that they would act as a counter-hegemonic force to what they have been doing. So that absolutely hits the nail on the head. And one other thing I wanted to point out, or two other things. One is the very important thing that Dr. Sami has also emphasized, and that's the question of the sovereignty and the independence of the Islamic world. This is why many of us have had hope in the Pakistan that is emerging today under the leadership of Imran Khan, but also the shifting geopolitics, which is allowing Pakistan, if it wants to take it, that chance to be more independent and sovereign in this situation, despite all of these pressures and threats. And the other thing I liked what Dr. Ramzy said about, the wars, the bombardment, the massacres, and the slaughters will continue in Palestine, and particularly in Gaza, as Dr. Ramzy was saying. And the Israeli embassy in Islamabad, could one imagine these generals or whoever whining and dining? I was just going to say, we really can't even imagine an Israeli embassy in Islamabad. So that just made me think about that. So I mean, I don't. That's one sign of hope. I don't think that the Pakistani people will never tolerate an Israeli embassy in Islamabad. So I was just thinking about that. I wanted to conclude our discussion by this question of what is the way forward. I know that we've spoken about a lot of things that specifically, I mean, Pakistan and other countries must do in terms of their rejection of this entire normalization process. But I think that looking concretely and specifically at what's going on, we are aware that there is a global solidarity campaign that has emerged for the Palestinians, particularly in the West, very robust and very impressive one that is emerging and growing. At the same time, the conditions within Palestine have just been abysmal and continue to get worse and worse. And on top of it, now we have this entire farce and of this normalization. Considering all of these things, I would like both of you to respond. What should we do? What should we continue doing? What is the way forward? So maybe Dr. Ramzy, you would want to begin?
Thank you. And again, thank you for hosting this important discussion. And I've learned a lot from you and Dr. Sami. Just a couple of quick things. Number one, the case of Pakistan itself. Pakistan was one of the very earlier supporters of the Palestinian struggle. Pakistan actually participated in trying to push back the Zionist colonial military drive in 1948. It also participated in the war of 1967 and 1973. The Israeli, the Pakistani rather, Air Force played an important role in trying to push back the further colonization and aggression of Israel and Zionism. And one interesting thing is actually well before the Arab League in Rabat, in the conference in Rabat in 1974, recognized the PLO as the sole and only representative and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, Pakistan actually did, and had a PLO office in Pakistan, in Lahore at the time, and so forth. So you have this trajectory of solidarity and support, and it was also met by equal Palestinian trajectory of support for Pakistan throughout the years as well, and that has to be noted as well. And the support of Kashmir in particular by the Palestinian people and Palestinian intellectuals and activists all over the world is a verifiable fact. We can't break this bond. We can't, under any circumstance, no matter what the pressures are and no matter what the perks are. Because if you break this bond, then you are taking on a new uncharted territories. You don't know what will happen if you lose such immoral political and geopolitical argument, but also when you find yourself in a position that you negate your own legacy of over 70 years of solidarity and support of the Palestinian people. But the other point that that includes Pakistan, but really branches out to the global scene as well, is that the case of Palestine is becoming now a global cause. Wherever you are in the world, wherever kind of activism for social justice or any sort of social or rather civil society fight anywhere in the world, you always find Palestine there. And I personally, in the last year alone, before COVID rather, or the previous year, I went to 14 different countries, from Australia and to Brazil, to New Zealand, to throughout Europe, Canada, the US. And it was absolutely astonishing to see how Palestine is now part of the central narrative of justice, any struggle for justice anywhere in the world. And that's really what scares Israel so much. Israel is a country that exists on the ground. It has a strong military, and that's going to be very difficult to defeat, at least in the near future. But what Israel doesn't have, as Dr. Sami mentioned earlier, legitimacy. And that's what it's fighting for. And that's what we are fighting for, to delegitimize the Israeli apartheid, Israeli racism, and so forth. We want Pakistan to be part of that fight, to continue to delegitimize military occupation, apartheid, colonialism, racism, and so forth. Not to be on the other side, especially that we finally have global awareness of the struggle in Palestine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramzy Baroud. Dr. Sami Al-Arian, your final remarks?
Sure. Again, what we have today in Palestine is a racist, colonialist settler project. It's a system. It's an apartheid system. And normalization basically is to legitimize this system. So morally speaking, no one should be part of legitimizing a racist, Zionist. When I say racist, that's what I mean. It's an apartheid-like system in Palestine. And I have identified in different forums, and I just sent you the link to one of the talks, that our goal should be to dismantle this system. Our goal should be to end racism in the world, and particularly as a systemic racist system in Palestine, which has existed now for many years. To do that, we have identified 12 different. I have identified 12 different imperatives to deal with it. One of them actually Pakistan could do it in a moment's notice, which is Israel thinks that because it has nuclear power, that it can solely use them, and therefore it can threaten its neighbors, and Pakistan could actually give a nuclear cover for the entire Arab world and for the entire Islamic world, and says if anybody is ever attacked by any power, including Israel, then they will have to face the consequences. We can neutralize that imperative right there, and Pakistan can play a big role in this. But aside from this, what we need on the state of what we could do is to establish a worldwide solidarity movement. And the aim, the target, the objective of this solidarity movement is to end racism in Palestine, is to end this apartheid system in Palestine, is to dismantle the institutions of racism and apartheid in Palestine. It's what we need to do. We need to have a Palestine, or we have a system in Palestine that recognizes everybody with equal rights, that it can deal with the Palestinians who are scattered and made into refugees generation after generation, that they would have the right as every human being to go back to their ancestors' homes and live there, and not to live in permanent disenfranchisement, to be always a stateless refugee generation after generation. That's what we need, not to legitimize a system that says only Jews have the right to live in Palestine, but Palestinians who have lived there for centuries are denied that right. Pakistan and Pakistani people and freedom-loving people and peace-loving people cannot be part of that narrative. And I understand that political winds today may go one way, but things change. They will swing back, where the people will actually rise up. We saw during the Arab Spring, when people revolted in every capital across the Arab world, they had their national national flag in one hand and Palestine in the other. If there is anything that unites the Arabs, unites the Muslims, unites freedom-loving people, it is the issue of Palestine. It is beyond the Palestinians. Palestinians, yes, they have been at the forefront as the vanguard of defending their rights and confronting and standing up to Zionism. But this struggle is beyond the Palestinians. It's really the struggle for every freedom-loving person across the world. And we could establish and reignite the struggle for freedom across the world when we all come together and struggle and fight the racist system in Palestine. That's what makes it really universal. And I think Pakistan and Pakistani people cannot be against this spirit, the spirit of standing up to what's right, standing up for freedom, for justice, and for the human progress and dignity, rather than going backward and trying to legitimize a racist, colonialist, settler state that wants to establish its control and hegemony on everyone in the region and beyond.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Sami. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramzy Baroud. I think that you have made the case, not only of the compelling case against normalization with Israel, but also how Pakistan should not be on the wrong side of history right now. It should be on the right side of history. The positions that we've heard from our Prime Minister against suffering and injustice in Kashmir, etc., and of course the positions he's so far taken on Palestine as well. This is being on the right side of history, and we should not succumb to the pressures of being, as you two have forcefully argued, of being on the wrong side of history, where there is injustice and cruelty is being meted out left, right, and center, and especially in Palestine. And what Dr. Sami said, Palestine as a metaphor of the larger struggle for justice and freedom throughout the world. So I want to, at this point, thank the both of you for coming. It was kind of like a reunion of all of us that CIGA, Center for Islam and Global Affairs, gets all of us together. And I look forward to the next time that we can all be together. So it was wonderful to have this reunion, to have your powerful voices speak to the Pakistani people and as Palestinians, and to remind us of our bonds, of our links, and what is the way forward to bring justice to the Palestinians, to the Pakistanis, and throughout the world. So I thank the both of you for coming on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Nothing will delight me more than coming to Pakistan and make that case to the Prime Minister and to others in person.
We are waiting for you for that. Inshallah, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, both of you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum.